Right now, on Law&Crime Special Report, Justice and Peace. 3 Wilmington, North Carolina police officers have been fired after a video recording captured the officers calling for a race war.
The conversations included disrespectful language, hate-filled speech, and referring to black people as the N-word.
Plus, an update on the tragic case of Elijah McClain. Colorado Governor Jared Polis has appointed a special prosecutor to look into McClain's death. Later, the NYPD officer who was caught on video using a chokehold on a man just days after the police reform legislation was passed has been charged with felony strangulation.
Let him go, bro! Let him go!
Justice and Peace bringing you inside the movement for police reform. It's Friday, June 26, 2020. Welcome, I'm your host, Brian Buckmire, here at Justice and Peace. Let's jump right into our first story of 3 officers who were fired for some of the language that they used, not only in using the N-word, but also their description of black people as a whole. Let's start off by looking at the presser that came out of North Carolina by Chief Officer Donnie Williams.
This investigation started as a result of a supervisor's routine inspection of a video from Officer Piner's in-car camera. No one told us about this. We discovered it on our own because we have processes and policies in place. After a review of the video, the supervisor discovered 2 conversations that Officer Piner had, one with Officer Gilmore and the other with Corporal Jesse Moore II. The conversations included disrespectful language, hate-filled speech, and referring to black people as the N-word. They also criticized me on this video. Several black officers within the agency and made negative comments about individuals outside of the agency. They made negative comments about our Black Lives Matter protest and were critical of our response. The 46-minute and 12-second conversations were brutally offensive and deserved immediate attention. You will find more details about the investigation in the public documents that we're releasing today. As a result, I have recommended that none of them be eligible for rehire in any position with the City of Wilmington. We will also notify the North Carolina Criminal Justice and Standards Commission on their behavior. The commission determines whether or not an officer can maintain their state certification to practice law enforcement. We will also consult with our District Attorney, Ben David, regarding their sustainability as witnesses, any biases they may have shown towards criminal defendants, and potential charges.
All right, so I'm joined with 2 guests here. Joseph Richardson, a civil rights attorney who is focusing on income and wealth disparity, predominantly in communities of color, as well as Charles F. Coleman Jr., a civil rights attorney and former Brooklyn prosecutor. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us and good afternoon. I want to jump right into this. Let's start with you, Joseph. It seemed to me that this was, I know they were kind of patting themselves on the back that they did this and no one else, but it seems like a bit of a fluke that it was caught, that it was reported, and it was brought to light during this audit, because but for all of these processes of someone stepping up where people don't always do so, this might have been swept under the rug. What do you make of how this came to light and the police officer's response?
I want to make a larger point about the fact that you cannot make a withdrawal of goodwill unless there's been a deposit. What we have happening now nationwide, and what a lot of what we're hearing, people protesting in the streets, et cetera, is about the fact that lives are not valued. Black lives are not valued. And so there's a question as to, even when these officers have been fired, they should have been fired, they should have never been there in the first place. There should have been a national registry already where the one that had all these other issues should not have been able to be hired anyway. You're still asking whether or not this happened for the right reason, to your point. So, you have these processes, you have someone, is this person a sacrificial lamb because it's so easy to get rid of him? And the other question is, are you so confident, or are we so satisfied with the fact that we've gotten a few folks that are caught red-handed getting fired that we don't deal with the larger culture? So clearly, There's no policy that allows a police officer to say what they've been saying, and to say these things and to talk about race war with people they're supposed to be protecting and serving. But what does this do with the culture? Culture, culture is always going to be policy. It's always going to be law. We've seen it over and over again. So my larger question is, what does Wilmington do in particular? What do these places do in general in policing? What do we do about culture? Because getting rid of a few guys, and there's a whole lot more people, statistically speaking, that feel that same way, that are still there, that haven't been caught on camera, that's not going to carry the day.
Yeah. And Joseph, you use the word culture. Some would also say systemic problems or systemic racism, that there is an infrastructure that is built around protecting these people. I want to bring Charles in, but Charles, I want us to both look at this, this clip from MSNBC that talks about how this operates as a culture, and I want to get your opinion on that.
But most striking to me is the resonance and meaning of these violent racist words in this particular place, Wilmington, North Carolina. It's a city that is in many ways a perfect representation of the trajectory of racial injustice in America. Because back in the late 1800s, after the Civil War and in Reconstruction, Wilmington was a thriving, fairly well-integrated town racially. That was thanks to the post-Civil War project of Reconstruction, which used the federal government to actively seek to integrate freemen and women as full citizens, to give them rights and more. And then came what was arguably the only pure coup d'etat in U.S. history, when a white supremacist mob violently wrenched power, overthrowing the city government, killing at least 60 African Americans, slaughtering them, wrenching power back with terrorist, white supremacist, fascist violence to regain white supremacy, a key moment in the destruction of this nation's project of racial equality and reconstruction. And the system those racists built, that is a system upon which we now stand. To the point where in the year 2020, Wilmington police officers are fantasizing about a race war where they could shoot black people that would put black Americans back about 4 or 5 generations, back to what happened in that same city.
So we're seeing there, Charles, a structure that is built, as the gentleman's saying there, upon institutional racism that's just promulgating. Now, I know you're a former prosecutor, but also a civil rights attorney. Oftentimes we're saying, well, we don't know if they're racist. Maybe just these actions are just off color or this. This sounds like and seems like a smoking gun, Charles. What do you see?
I see something that is endemic of what has always been the systemic and systematic maintenance of physical, economic, and psychological violence against Black Americans. And police culture in America has a history. It comes from a history of just that. People need to understand that the police, the earliest iteration of police in America, were in fact the slave patrols. And they were intended to actually capture and to return Black Africans as property. That has been of policing in America, and it continues to be the systemic nature of how policing in America is executed, particularly within communities of color. And so this is very much so endemic of a systemic problem and not just about a few officers who were off color or making bad comments. And I think your original point, Brian, is very, very important. What happens if this conversation isn't discovered in the manner that it is? What happens to the other conversations that are missed, that aren't checked, that don't have the benefit of somehow a supervisor, ultimately getting lucky in terms of being able to find this? You don't get points for getting lucky when you're talking about a systemic issue. And as a prosecutor, or former prosecutor rather, this gives me grave concern because at this point, from a civil rights perspective, now as a civil rights attorney, I want to see every arrest, every stop, every conviction, every witness that any of these officers have ever even touched. Because what it tells me is that this problem is systemic and endemic of a larger issue.
Yeah, and it's not just them. I want to break down what that officer or that chief officer said in that presser. He's talking about Officer Piner, which is one of the officers who had a conversation with Captain Moore. Then there's a separate conversation with Officer Piner with Gilmore. Now, 2 of those 3 officers have been either terminated or demoted in other police departments. What I want our viewers to really focus on is that this officer in this presser said that he no longer wants these officers to work in Wilmington. So the question becomes, where does this trash get shuffled over to? Because it's not going to remain in Wilmington, but that doesn't mean that they will not be hired in a different city. Does that solve the problem at all?
Absolutely
No,
not.
I think it just moves it one way. What do you think, Charles?
Absolutely not. I think this reminds me of the 2016 shooting by Betty Shelby of Terrence Crutcher, who viewers may recall was a black man who was standing complying with law enforcement orders, had his hands up, and she still ended up pulling the trigger and killing him. She was fired from the police department where she worked, but later ended up getting and later, after she was acquitted, ended up getting a job as a sheriff's deputy in a neighboring town. So we've seen this before. We've seen this movie before, and we know how problematic it is when law enforcement essentially can go from one bad act on one force to getting a job somewhere else on another force. That is a significant problem. Already in the state of Florida, we saw officers and police departments down there inviting the officer Derek Chauvin, who's responsible for killing George Floyd, inviting him to come work there once he was fired, right? So it's almost as if the culture of policing has treated this as a joke. If you get in trouble in one department or have an issue here, it certainly doesn't bar you from working somewhere else in the law enforcement field, and that is a significant problem in this culture.
Yeah, and we got to take a quick break, but I know Joseph had even commented on that when he brought up the fact that there's no national database, so these people can just go from one area to another area, which asks the question, can I go from one area to another? Because maybe I'm not safe in Wilmington or wherever these officers go. But we'll be back after this break.
We want to focus on the Golden State Killer.
I do think he has a constitutional right to a speedy trial, but these are very different times today.
That this evidence is very strong.
The man who terrorized California may have been living right here.
Publicly shared DNA data to track down the suspected Golden State Killer.
He could still be ultimately sentenced to death, it's just the execution might not happen.
All right, next we move back to Colorado to get an update from the Elijah McClain case. Now, this case got widespread responses both from this network and around the country. It appears that our voice has been heard as the governor of Colorado is pressing to reopen that case. Let's take a look.
It shouldn't take millions of people signing a petition, and it shouldn't take international media attention for elected officials to do their jobs.
While the family wants charges against officers, they hope the public will remember Elijah as a kind young man.
He was an angel among humans. He would go to play his violin on his lunch hour to animals who were waiting to be adopted so they wouldn't be lonely. The public sees through that effort to avoid accountability and is now standing up and saying, Aurora needs to take responsibility and do what's right.
Now, Joseph, I want to bring you in on this. We got a few minutes, probably bring you guys both in. But with the Elijah case, I think it bothers me in 2 ways. One, I don't think this should take millions of voices to find justice, because I don't think we all have to have our eyes on every state and every precinct to make sure they do their job. They should be doing it of themselves. But 2, while Elijah McClain, by all accounts, seems to be the best of us, I know there are people, I won't name them or her, within our community that seems to think we need to be martyrs or saints to have people root for us or advocate for us. But why does it seem like it always needs to be the best of us that has to die before there's action?
You know, it's amazing. We always have this perpetual state of being on trial when something happens. And Elijah looks like somebody that wouldn't hurt anyone. He's not physically imposing. And for us to be even having this conversation today, to your point, Brian, it took a different climate with the killing of George Floyd. It took 2 million signatures, and it took the related shame You know, they've basically been shamed into doing this. And what's crazy is he looks like, from a principal standpoint, or from the way that he is as a person, the way that he was a person, may he rest in peace, that he's going to pass every test. He's not violent. He doesn't have a violent past, you know, any of those types of things. But even then, even if he does pass that test, he's still considered more the exception than the rule. He's more miraculous than he is indicative. It doesn't make people say there's more like him. That makes them say he's not like the others. So again, we're fighting this situation where Elijah is on trial now. He will be on trial should there be a trial, right? And even then, it doesn't make people say that maybe we have to reevaluate the fact that we need to value everyone and to believe in a common humanity. There's no way this kid was no match for 3 police officers. Okay, he was no match for 3 police officers. But on a larger standpoint, he's no match for this system, for this culture, for the systemic racism that permeates throughout our culture and doesn't just find an island in police work. So if I've grown up intentionally, non-intentionally racist, whatever the case may be, and now I become a police officer, I don't stop being that, but now I have it with a gun, with authority, and with society's benefits of the doubt. We're no match for that.
Yeah. And from my understanding is they even went back to work. There's still officers in that precinct. Charles, talk to us about the ability of officers to commit acts like this, to be internally investigated and then put back on the street. How can that community feel safe?
So I think you're absolutely right. I think that one of the issues that we don't talk about that's a huge part of this conversation is the notion of qualified immunity. A lot of average citizens are not aware of qualified immunity and how problematic it has become in terms of enabling and empowering police culture to remain as violent, as lethal, and as harmful to communities of color as it is. I want to go back to a very quick point that Joe made, and I think that it's really, really important that we understand. When you talk about, Elijah passing the test, I think that is, and we all understand this already, how poorly framed this conversation has been when it has become about victims of color. When it comes to Black, and particularly Black men, this conversation is so poorly framed that we are doubly victimized by having not only to establish our innocence, but beyond establishing our innocence, we have to establish our humanity. Both of those things speak counter to what our criminal justice system is intended to do. You are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, rather than having to establish your innocence. And the question of your humanity is not one which should be left up to a police officer to decide whether you get to live or to die. And, when we have the conversation, unfortunately, too many of us, like you said, Brian, are waiting for the perfect victim and the martyr in order to step forward and stand up for and defend. But the reality is, when you get that victim, you turn around and then say, well, he's not like the rest. He's so different that this situation is an anomaly. And so it's a lose-lose on both sides.
Absolutely. I think we might have paused there, and I'm sorry that we lost your connection there, Charles. I know you're going to come back in a second, but I want to switch gears. Charles will be back with us in a bit. Now to the NYPD officer who was caught strangling an individual in Queens, New York. He's being charged with a D felony of strangulation. Let's take a look at that body cam video again.
Love, give me a breath of life. Stoner, go ahead. I ain't driving shit. You yo, nigga, what the fuck are you doing, bro? What are you doing? Get away from me, bro. I didn't even do it. Oh, bro. I'm like, come here, bro. I didn't even do it. Yeah, of course you didn't.
We're on camera too.
Just stay back. Stop blocking the view. Well, I'm just trying to go. This is shit. Yo, stop choking him, bro. You guys can record. Yo, stop choking him. Yo, he's choking him. Let him go, bro. Let him go. Look. Back up. Yo, back the fuck up away from me. Back up. Come on, chill. You choking him. Yo, stop choking. He's choking him. Yo, he's fucking. Yo, he's choking him. We're not doing nothing wrong. Yo, call my brother, man. Let's go. Word? All right. I want to see the
All right, so we got about 2 minutes before we got to bring in Bob Bianchi for our next show, Keeping the Peace. Make sure you stay tuned for his show as well. But I want to give each one of you individuals a minute. Charles, you've got the former Brooklyn prosecutor background. We're seeing here that he's being charged with strangulation, which is basically, the way New York puts it, is obstruction of breathing, or the ability for someone to breathe or have that blood circulate in their system that causes them to lose consciousness or go into a stupor. That's what this officer is being charged with. What do you see in this case? Do you think it is valid? Do you think it is right? Do you think it's appropriate for the times?
I absolutely think that it's a valid charge. It's a start. I think hopefully what's happening here is that there is a slow and steady approach to justice in terms of sending the message to police. I do think that there should be an examination of additional charges here. When I saw that video, I thought that there might be the potential for an aggravated assault, another felony charge, to be included. But I think that the strangulation is probably the most political move that's being done as a means of ensuring that there's a possibility of a strong possibility of a conviction.
And Joseph, same thing. The thing that blew my mind was New York decided on this like days before this officer did this action. What, he didn't get the memo or something? Or again, is this just so embedded in the culture that no matter how many George Floyds or Elijah McClains or Breonna Taylors they see, this just seems to be, this is what I do when I go to work.
There's many fronts here, and there's an absolute expectation that these officers have that they won't be held to account. And so they didn't get the memo, or they got the memo and didn't care. I'm frankly glad that the brother lived. In another place and time without other people looking, he might not have survived at all. And so at the end of the day, what we have are people that are supposed to protect and serve that are saying, I might not serve you if I don't look like you. You don't look like me. And I definitely won't serve you if you question me. This is not like, a candy shop where you can refuse service to someone that's not acting well. You still have to protect and serve. And that's going to take you some places. But these folks, the bad officers, and in a larger system. I mean, this is, NYPD has had many bad days. We need to go no further than Abner Louima or whoever else. But there is an expectation that's going to take many, many years and consistent work to undo. And you're going to have to do it from a societal standpoint and all the way down.
Absolutely agree. And the saddest part of that is we're happy he's still alive, and such a low standard. But that's the reality we live in now. Survive that encounter is huge. We'll see you again next week, guys.